So you have a ton of different projects going on right now. I mean, it makes it sound like you're just writing all the time and don't sleep. But before we get into any of the other ones aside from Black Swan, I thought it would be interesting to start with a question that was submitted via Twitter because IFP opened up questions that could be submitted and they selected their favorite. Not necessarily because it's the best question, but I actually think it would be a good way to sort of get into some of the undercurrents of your work. So let me just let me read this one from Vic Randope. His question is: were the works of Franz Kafka and Roman Polanski bigger influences on the piece than the original Black Swan? So we're getting right into it.
Gotcha. Well, hello everyone. First of all, thanks for having me here. I'm not sure what he means by the original Black Swan.
The ballet.
Or Swan Lake.
Swan Lake.
Gotcha. No. I would say, Franz Kafka, unless in some sort of very subconscious way, I suppose, played a role, but not in any kind of overt way. Polanski, of course, reigned supreme in terms of films that we watched and talked about during the process, but in some ways it was less about watching his films and being like, oh, we should do that too, and more about, okay, someone else has done something crazy like this and it worked, so we're not alone here. Right. But Swan Lake, that was my starting off point for the whole thing. The first outline I wrote was half the page was the outline of the film, and the second half was the Swan Lake breakdown and sort of showing how the real world story was going to parallel the story of the ballet. So it was the real guiding influence behind everything.
Well, the reason why I think a question like that is interesting is because when people look at the work of Darren Aronofsky, they're looking at very dark themes and they're trying to figure out, where is this guy coming from? What inspires that kind of dark vision? And obviously, in this case, there is something very specific that it was adapted from. But there are so many other things going on there, and people try to find a way to explain it through what they understand. And looking at some of the descriptions of the other films that you're working on, they have these sort of, whether it's like something apocalyptic or sort of creepy sci-fi aspects, or just about like the mysteries of human relationships. It seems like in many ways the stuff that you and Darren are into sync up, and so it makes a lot of sense that you've been working with him at, from a very early stage in your career. So can you talk a little bit about the genesis of that collaboration and how it led up to writing Black Swan?
Sure, yeah. And I think it's true. People do want to figure out the source of an idea and sort of where someone's taste has come from. And I think that there is no single origin in that way. I think different people, artists, writers, and just normal people are drawn to what they're drawn to, and it's hard to know exactly why that is. But in terms of how I started working with Darren, I went to grad school at NYU, and he was like a guest teacher the last year of my program. And he came in like for 3 classes, and after the last class, it's sort of funny, but I had said something in class that he kind of liked, and then a friend of mine in the class asked me to stay behind to take his picture with Darren, and I did. And as a result, I just walked out of the building with Darren, and we continued kind of talking about what we'd been talking about in class. And by the end of that conversation, he invited me to like come work for him.
So at this point, he had made Pie and...
He was in post on The Fountain at the time.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, he'd made Pie and Requiem. And of course, I called his producing partner at the time and was like, Darren says I should come work for you. And he was like, well, that's weird because we don't have any jobs at all. So I don't know why he told you that. And so I just kept in touch for the next few months, and his assistant happened to be leaving at the end of the summer. And so I started as Darren's assistant through the end of The Fountain. And that's kind of how it started. And then after I'd worked as his assistant for like 5-6 months, I still haven't actually technically graduated from NYU because I still had my thesis film to make. Still do have my thesis film to make. And I told Darren at the end of 5 months, like, it's been great, I've learned a lot, this has been wonderful, but I really should go back to school and finish my film. And he was like, why don't I make you my director of development instead, because we had just gotten a new overhead deal. And it was like an offer I couldn't refuse, really. So I started, and then The Wrestler was the first thing I developed for him with Rob Siegel, the writer. And and then I became one of the producers on that. And it was during The Wrestler where Darren and I would ride to and from set some days, and we'd talk about everything kind of going on at the company. And at a certain point, I told him, I'd like to get back into writing because that's kind of where I'd come from and what I'd been studying in school, writing and directing. And he was like, I still want to make something in the ballet world. You want to do some thinking about that project and see if you can kind of come up with a take. And I said yes, having basically no knowledge or experience about ballet whatsoever, but just sort of you say yes when that question gets asked. And that was basically the start. We kept talking, and eventually where that conversation got to was he had always been attracted to ballet. He'd always thought Swan Lake would figure in the film in some way or another. And where we got to is, instead of Swan Lake just being one aspect of the movie, why don't we just make the whole movie Swan Lake and build the whole thing out of it?
And there was at a certain point he said he had always envisioned The Wrestler being part of the same story, at least thematically on some level.
I think early on, early on it was much more vague. Like, okay, this is another movie about like a performer, and it's at like the high end of culture as opposed to the low end. So it did feel like there was some sort of connection between the two pieces, which I think he was attracted to. And then as I was working on it and developing what the story would be, especially the ending became like, at a certain point I was like, you do know, Darren, that like it's basically the same ending. Is that okay? And he, at that point it became a much like full embrace, like this will, and that's when he decided to do the shooting style the same as he had done in The Wrestler. And at that point it's like, rather than it just being sort of like loosely connected, it became much more overt to connect the two.
So how many complete screenplays had you written at this point?
Ones that weren't horrible, I would probably count.
I guess you had some stuff that was workshopped here. And
yeah, and those ones weren't the horrible ones. No, I'd written, I think, 2 or 3 by then. And then a few crappy ones.
Right. And obviously this was a fundamentally different experience because you were collaborating with somebody who had a specific thing in mind.
Yeah, it's certainly easier, than writing in a vacuum. So yeah, it was helpful in that way. It was also but it's also very different in that, when you're writing your own thing, Darren is very much a sort of trial and error kind of a person, meaning that like he needs to see something on its feet and sort of like see it executed to fully decide what's working about it and what's not. So it's like there was a lot, I went through a lot of drafts just sort of tacking sort of different directions just to see how it would work. So that it's not like the whole process was about like honing in on one thing. It was more like there was a lot of offshoots and various versions of the story that I had to go fully, down the road.
Well, speaking of seeing things on their feet, I mean, there's so much that's physical about not only watching the movie, but I have a copy of the screenplay here, and it's really interesting to read just the first, page or two where those of you who've seen the movie know that it opens without, there's several minutes go by before there's a single line of dialogue. It's just a lot of movement, and you see a piece of the ballet as a dream sequence, and it does come alive on the page in a very different sort of way, so that I imagine that you must have, not being a ballet person, you must have had to do a little bit of research to figure out, how do you describe these kind of movements, and how do you make that make sense in the written word?
Yeah, that was really hard. I mean, before I started writing anything, really, I went to American Ballet Theater, and over the course of like 2 or 3 months, sat in on a bunch of rehearsals and performances, and then watched, documentaries and kind of every book I could find. And at first, it felt like, that I was a total fraud, and I was never ever going to be able to like convey this at all, because you go to something that's that specialized that people have spent their whole lives learning and perfecting, and you're just kind of coming into it as a tourist, and it feels very much like I have no access to actually what's going on. But slowly, stuff started to rise to the surface, and the more and more I watched and the more I read and stuff, I actually started to understand. and even the specialized terms and stuff like that. You know, I started to know what they were.
What sort of things did you watch and read to figure that out?
Well, there's a lot of great. I mean, Frederick Wiseman has a great couple of documentaries about ballet, and then there's a bunch. There's a ton of stuff. There's a great. I think it's Swedish. This film called The Dancer, which is great. And there was stuff about Balanchine, played very heavily, and then read a bunch of memoirs. Tony Bentley wrote a memoir of her time in New York City Ballet that was very important. This woman, this book called Dancing on My Grave, which is a great ballerina memoir. Those were just a few. And then, of course, the occasional internet search to try to figure out the exact French term for like that particular movement in dance.
Watching YouTube videos to see how they move.
Yeah,
and stuff.
exactly.
Well, it's interesting when the first page of this, there's something like, it looks like 6 different drafts or 6 different revisions listed on the first page of the screenplay. Does that, did you really go through 6 drafts, or how did that work?
No, I mean, those revisions that are marked there are, you know, when you're in production, every time you release a set of revisions, and some of those revisions only consisted of like a changed scene or two. And by change, it could be a slight change of location or a change of dialogue. So that's sort of misleading. Those were not 6 distinct drafts by any means. But by the time I went through about like 8 or 9 relatively distinct drafts before the start of production. But then once production started, which is what those drafts represent, they weren't really that different. It was mostly scenes being cut. There was a little bit of dialogue work, like as we were shooting, that I had to do sort of on the fly. But each time there would be like 14 sort of changed pages, but in really, really minor ways.
So you stayed involved through the entire shooting process, and were there specific things about the way that the film started to look that surprised you or caught you off guard? You know, having seen this movie in your head and talked it out with Darren for such a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always the production design. You know, in writing the script, you know, I never really thought that much about like a controlled color palette, for instance. You know, in my head, this was just sort of reality, and I wasn't thinking that much other than pink, really, because that's such a part of the ballet world. But and so, you know, you get to set, and this very, very controlled palette was come up with, and so that's sort of like, oh, okay, that's like one level of stylization. And yeah, there's little things all along, like, oh, this apartment isn't quite the apartment I had in my head. I mean, everything is slightly different, but not in a bad way necessarily. It's just it'd be impossible to have all those specifics. And for the most part, it's a great feeling because for me, screenplay writing is really about efficiency and about like setting up scenes very efficiently and conveying sort of the basic sense of place, character, action, all that stuff in as few words as possible. But as a result, there's something very skeletal about a screenplay, always, I think. And so showing up on set and seeing all the costume work and production design work, and it's suddenly this very bare bones universe you've created is being given all this flesh and blood, and it's actually incredibly just like exciting and very cool.
Yeah, although despite all the flashiness of it, it's a very intimate movie. Darren tends to bring the camera so close you think it's gonna like run into Natalie Portman's face sometimes. But you know, I mean, that performance is so central to what makes the movie work. I mean, obviously she won the Oscar for a reason. I mean, when you were writing this, it seems like you had to really burrow inside this person's mind because so much stuff happens where you don't know if it's real or not, and it's all based around the way that she perceives things. So despite all the big production aspects, it seems like the biggest challenge for you must have been trying to figure out how do you sort of replicate this person's subjectivity.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the real, there's so many aspects to it that at any given point are sort of like challenging, and you're tackling that. It's hard to, there was no one thing that became the only thing you're thinking about and working on, but I think when you're making a film about someone essentially having a mental breakdown, it's you worry about whether or not the audience is going to like want to go on this ride with this person, because, if someone's just kind of crazy and going through this thing that's just kind of her going crazy, I feel like that lacks kind of dramatic stakes inherently, because it's like, well, she should just not be crazy. Like, why am I caring about this crazy person? So I think the big challenge was making sure that, like, what obstacles she had in her life were, even though there were things that were imagined and things happening to her that weren't really real, that there were enough sort of that the other characters were actually pushing back against her in a real way, so that there still felt like actual conflict and not just sort of made up, imagined conflict.
A lot of different screenwriters have their own strategies for creating characters, or at least figuring out how to distinguish their own voice from who these people are. John Sayles writes these detailed character bios, for example. Did you have any particular approach like that in order to figure her out?
Yeah, I mean, the first step of it was trying to figure out, how this person is changed by this experience. And, I always kind of start with, like, where do they begin the film and, like, where do they end, more or less. And there were certain parameters given to me because the ballet ends in a certain way, and it was important to Darren to end the film in a parallel way to the ballet. So I sort of more or less knew what the ending point was going to be. But then trying to figure out how, taking a character on this journey that ends in her death, figuring out how that's going to be meaningful and not just like, that's a bummer, but like have some sort of, added layer of either metaphor or just something. So
it's almost a happy ending.
Yeah. You try to find the sort of the transcendent part of it, and same with the wrestler, so that was hard. I don't have like a particular in this case. I very early on sort of saw her arc as sort of in a broadly speaking sense, going from White Swan to Black Swan. And then I was like, well, what does that mean? I understand that those are two different roles you can dance and that they have slightly different styles of dance that those roles encompass. But from a non-dance perspective, if you threw that out, what would that mean for this girl, emotionally? And so then the sexual thing kind of came into it. And then, so going from someone who's like a sort of prudish to someone who's sensual. But then, we just added layers of that. So, like, what did it mean to be a white swan and what did it mean to be a black swan? And just added, layers of that.
Did you speak to any dancers around that age or people who had gone through those kind of experiences?
Yeah, spoke to a lot. Just in sitting in rehearsals and stuff, would casually talk to some. And then Julie Kent, who is a principal at ABT, was very helpful. And then I also had a good friend who had been a professional ballet dancer and had retired, and who had gone through not as harrowing a journey in her time, but something somewhat similar. And she was very, very helpful early on in reading drafts and sort of helping.
I was thinking about, other movies that have dealt with this, and you mentioned Frederick Wiseman. When I was watching Black Swan, initially, especially during the early rehearsal scene when Vincent Cassel's character first shows up, I was thinking about Robert Altman's film, The Company, and what that movie does, which is sort of peel back the romance of being a ballet dancer and to show, how uncomfortable it is, which to a certain extent Black Swan does as well. It uses genre in a more specific way to convey that. And I think that's what really, startled people in a good way when the movie first started showing up at film festivals, was that, you could look at this thing as a horror movie about stage fright or something. It's very accessible to different people on different levels in that regard. If you're a ballet person, you can look at it as a movie about ballet, but you can also just come to it as this is about somebody just losing their mind, which is much more universal. So did you guys talk about the way that genre plays a role in the effectiveness of this film?
Yeah. The other... A big part of our conversation through the development was sort of like we had this like almost like a horror dial. And there would be drafts of the script where we'd be like, this feels too much like really like a drama and there's not enough horror elements. And I mean, it had always been conceived of from the very beginning as, some sort of horror thriller, not like full on Argento sort of slasher horror, but like some, more Polanski kind of a thing. And so then we would turn the dial up, and I'd go batshit in terms of throwing crazy stuff in there, like every other page, something nuts. And we'd be like, all right, well, that's way too far, because now it just feels nuts. So we kept just sort of adjusting that dial as we went.
It still gets pretty nuts, though.
It gets pretty nuts, so you can imagine. Actually, the third act was always more or less stayed in place because we knew we wanted to build to that kind of thing. The challenge was like building a ramping up so that like by the time you get there, you're willing to go along with the ride because enough sort of like real things you're grounded in a world. So but you want to ramp it up so that it's not like doesn't feel like kind of a drama, and then suddenly on page 60 she's sprouting feathers, and you're like, what's going on? So you needed enough of those kind of early on things to let people know what kind of movie this is and that it is going to go to crazy places.
Mm-hmm. So all the complex sort of visual things that happen when she starts to get more and more nervous, the painting's coming alive or her sprouting feathers and during the imaginary sex scene and things like that. Were those things that you had some basic outline and then sort of got into it, the details as you wrote it, or was it already conceived ahead of time?
No, well, early on, even before I started writing the script itself, Darren, and we were just continuing to talk about it, he was like, well, if we're going to base this whole film off of Swan Lake and sort of like take that story but then set it in the real world, then she should probably turn into a swan. And that was just like an early on thing that he told me, and I was like, okay. And in my head, it was like, well, that's nuts. Like I just had no idea how that was going to work exactly, but he felt very strongly that like we needed to get her to be a swan at some point. And so, in talking about things that I knew were going to land in the third act, but that we needed to somehow build throughout the film so that it didn't just like wasn't a jump the shark moment. That's where the rash kind of came out of, which is this sort of psychological, like a slow growth of these feathers throughout the film. So the rash was sort of, it was built out of trying to justify getting to the swan. And then once the rash was there, it wasn't until, like, I put the moments in the script of, like, where the rash is appearing in the scenes, but in terms of, like, what level of rash it was at, that was during production. Darren assigned with the special effects makeup artist was like, I want to see her rash from 1 to 7. And so he did like the stages of the rash from 1 to 7, and then he would assign in different parts of the script, like the rash in this scene is a 3, and then it's a 6, and then it goes back to 2. And he would sort of assign a number sort of based somewhat on like her, the stress she was undergoing within that particular scene. And so the more stress it was, the more rash there was. But in the script itself, I didn't quite map the sort of like exact rise and fall of the rash. But that particular psychosis came out of, this swan idea.
Right. Well, I mean, for Natalie Portman, it must have been particularly grueling to read through the thing and see, just how uncomfortable she was going to have to look on screen. What was it like to see her take this stuff that you said she had to do, or the way that she had to look, and sort of, make it her own performance?
I haven't had a ton of experience. The Wrestler was really my first feature that I was there for the whole thing, and then this was the second. So, but in terms of like, she showed up on set day one and was just so fully already this character and like ready for hell. And I mean, she'd already lost a ton of weight. She'd already been training for a long, long time. So she came in ready for battle. So there was it was never an issue to like get her to go with it or like really, really dig in. She showed up day one kind of ready to play.
And obviously she would have to be. As far as the other actors went, I mean, did you have any role in coaching them as far as motivation or any of that? I mean, I'm sure you did table reads and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, different ones of them were more wanting to engage with the script in different ways. Never something like, this is what your motivation is, but like Vincent, especially because English is not his first language, and this was, fairly challenging for him from a language standpoint. He and I would talk just about like, in terms of like what the lines meant on sort of a literal level, and then also try to like shape the lines a little bit to be ones that he understood. He didn't want us to be saying things in words that he didn't actually know what they meant. And then Barbara was very, very like wanting to talk endlessly, but not with really any changes in mind. She just really enjoyed sort of talking about her character and about the script, and so I'd spend time with her. And then, but Natalie was much more like, she understood it, she got it, and she really, really made it her own. And there weren't, once we got into production, there weren't that many big changes anyway. And the first like half of production, I sort of stayed in, out of people's way and sort of just hung out by the monitors and sort of assumed that my job was more or less done, and if anyone needed anything, they'd ask me for it, but otherwise I'd keep my mouth shut, because at that point it was really Darren's show to run. And then, but about halfway through the shoot, I was riding away from set, and he asked me, I can't remember exactly what it was, but he was like, what did you think when, Natalie did such and such? And I was like, well, it's okay, but I sort of thought the point of that scene was blank, so that the next scene, and he was like, oh, you're right. Why didn't you say anything? And I was like, oh, well, and he was like, well, next, don't, you should hang around and like be closer, and like if you see stuff like that, make sure to get my ear, like be smart about it. Don't just like yell it out in front of everyone. But so I had to be like, I had to pick my battles, and I had to like send text messages like meet me at Crafty, and sort of be sort of sneaky about it. So because actors don't want to see other people coming in to like give notes on what they're doing. It's like it's a delicate thing.
Sure. So we're gonna go to questions in just a minute here. Really quickly, you have one screenplay that's already been produced, and a few others that you're currently working on. Can you just outline those really quickly?
Sure. Yeah. Well, he mentioned Sarah N12, which is actually not something I've written, but someone else I went to NYU with. I helped her sort of shape the story, and then I'm producing it. And then there's another script I wrote while I was in film school still with a friend of mine named Craig Johnson, called The Skeleton Twins, which is hopefully coming close to getting made. And then in terms of me just as a writer, I'm writing something else for Darren called Machine Man, which is based on a novel by Max Berry, this Australian novelist. And it's basically the story of a biotech engineer who starts cutting off pieces of his body and replacing them with sort of cyber parts. It's like Cronenberg's Iron Man is the shorthand.
It's good sell.
And then I'm doing something for Mark Webb called Age of Rage, which is sort of a Lord of the Flies / 28 Days Later kind of movie about
So after he does Spider-Man.
After he does is the idea, if I do a good enough job for him. And then, so basically those two things.
It's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to questions from the crowd. All the way in the back, I saw a hand.
Hi, I'm Jenny. Nice to meet you. I just had a question about the mother character in the script. There's a lot of things floating around that maybe she didn't exist at all, and what was her purpose, and can you just speak on developing that character and what the intention was?
Sure. Well, I enjoy the sort of debates that rage about various theories, so I'm certainly not going to shut down that conversation. But she, like I said, in sort of shaping Nina's character of one that goes from a from a white swan to a black swan, and sort of figuring out what the obstacles to that transformation were above just her own like head and psychology. I decided early on, she needed like a stumbling block character that was sort of like pushing her to remain innocent, remain young, and a mother just sort of makes sense as that. So the mother's character name, though it's never said in the film, is Erica, and the demon in the ballet is Eric von Rothbart. So I always sort of imagined her as the sort of like somewhat evil force that's like trapping her daughter, but then there's what cuts against the grain of that is that once you realize how sick her daughter is, then suddenly her care and concern actually are given a slightly more justified origin. So, I enjoyed sort of playing with the idea that, like, yes, the mother is going overboard in her tactics, but her reason for being so overly concerned is actually sort of strangely justified.
There are these little references to the fact that she, wanted to be essentially where her daughter is now.
Yeah, it's that interesting, like, parent-child dynamic that I think can often exist, which is, especially if you're in the same realm or, like, the kid is living out the parent's dream in some way, is that on the one hand, there's this vicarious pleasure of like, oh, you're getting to do all the things I would want to do, but then the jealousy that also comes with that. So it's sort of like, it's this double-edged sword of pride and then also competition.
Any other questions? Let's go with you.
Oh.
The question was, what was the tenor of that provocative conversation you had with
You
Darren?
make it sound much more exciting than it was. It wasn't so provocative. It was essentially, sort of long story short, but in class he was going around to everyone in class asking them to summarize their thesis film thematically. So not like what the plot was, but just sort of like what the core idea was that they were hoping to convey. And it was, a room full of directors, and there was sort of like, well, it's sort of about coming of age, but it's also kind of about good versus evil, and I guess it's also sort of about, and people were having sort of a hard time consolidating it. And so he came to me, and I did what I thought my thing was about at the time, the as yet unmade thesis film. And then as the kind of class went on, as people struggled, he would go back to me and ask me to do it for them. And so I did that just like a few times. So as we were walking out of class, he was just curious if like I had ever worked as a development person or a CE, because he was like, that's a very useful skill to be able to sort of like reduce kind of these big things to simple nuggets. And I didn't even know what development was at the time or any of that stuff. So I was sort of like, no. So I don't remember it much more than that, but that was kind of how the conversation got started.
You got to tell us what the thesis film was about.
My parents, I'm from New Mexico originally, and my parents had been hippies that had gone out to New Mexico and lived in teepees for a couple years and stuff like that. And so it was actually the day in the life of my brother during that time, when sort of based on a true story, where he runs away from a birthday party and meets up with this sort of vagabond girl who's on the run.
Sounds fun. All right. Whole bunch of right here with the right there, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Okay, I just wanted to ask you, there's 3 writers listed on the film, and Andre Heinz is credited with the story. So how did that work?
Well, without boring you to tears, so Andres, like 10 years ago, I think, had written a script called The Understudy that was sort of a thriller set in the world of off-Broadway theater. And before I started to work for it, I think right after Pi, actually, Darren had come across that script and had for a second talked about directing it as his second movie, as The Understudy. And he ended up doing Requiem instead. And then years later, around the time of The Fountain, when he started getting interested in maybe doing a ballet movie, he was like, maybe we should go back to that Understudy script and try to reset it in the world of ballet. So the second writer, John McLaughlin, that's more or less what he did, take that same basic plot of The Understudy and reset it in ballet. And then that kind of hit a wall for a lot of reasons, but some of it was that The Understudy is such a relationship so specific to Broadway theater that didn't quite translate to the ballet world, and there's also like a murder mystery aspect to it where a character gets killed early on, and then the understudy takes her part, and then it turns out she's the one that killed her, and it threw things over a little bit too far into genre land. Then I came in kind of after that process, and as a result of arbitration and the fun of that, that's where the credits fell.
What else we got?
Mm-hmm.
Right next to you.
Can you talk a little bit about writing a female protagonist, and how did that work with all these guys involved?
Well, you have to use the pronoun she a lot. Is the main difference. It was never. I think if we had, for all the sort of accusations of a bunch of dudes writing a female role, if we had tried and gone like, all right, we're writing a female role, we gotta write it like from a woman's perspective, I think we would have ended up making it even more off. It was not something I just was writing a character. I didn't. The one aspect of it that I think is heavily gendered is the fact that she's a ballerina, and that's a particular kind of experience, one that involves a lot of scrutiny of your body, more so for ballerinas than male ballet dancers, although true in both, because it's an art form that's all about the body and the perfection of the body and all of that. So, but I do think I just made it very specific to being a ballerina, which does happen to be like a gendered experience. But I didn't, I was never consciously like, how would a woman handle this situation? Because I think if I had, it would have been very dangerous.
Well, let's go back over here. Yeah, you right there.
I don't know the plot of Swan Lake, but I'm just curious from a structural standpoint, because all of us as screenwriters read books and magazine articles and structure's king. And I've loved the movie and didn't pay any attention to that because I was just swept up in it. How closely do you think you followed the so-called rules of contemporary sort of Hollywood structure in the movie?
I don't know. You tell me. I'm not that. I'm familiar with basically, like, we talk hero's journey a lot, Darren and I. So that is one we sort of like look at and think about to a certain degree. I mean, one nice thing about hero's journey is that, first of all, it's always tailored to the main character. So even though it's structural, sort of the beats of the journey are actually more about like what is the emotional need that this character has to go through than some sort of like, on page 20 there has to be a reversal. Like, it's not as hard and fast as that. But I do think we did try to have it follow some sort of hero's journey thing, but I think it's so open to interpretation about like what the approach to the innermost cave is and all those kind of silly things that I don't know. I don't know how closely it cues. I think it doesn't cue that closely. I think in a lot of ways, just because I think the film goes off the rails, especially in that third act, in a kind of a crazy, insane way that it's hard to imagine that really fits any sort of structure. Once you have a main character sort of sprouting wings, and it's like it's hard to know, how closely you're hewing to anything.
We have time for maybe two more. Let's go all the way in the back. I don't want to forget you guys.
All of my favorite moments in the movie were all really funny. There was sort of these great moments, like when the guy walks by and he's in the costume and he says hi when she's freaking out, which got a big laugh in the screening that I was in. And I was just wondering if you found those movies, at what point in your process did you find those sort of humor moments, or if you knew they were funny when you wrote them, or if you think they're funny now?
There's a little bit of everything. I mean, that particular example was one that kind of we came up with on set, because that poor actor had to spend so much time in his makeup that he was there like during lunch, like eating, like saying hi to people, and we just thought it was just kind of hysterical. But we didn't even know what the costume would look like, so it would have been hard to find the comedy of that ahead of time. But so that one was sort of discovered in the moment. And then there's, some of Vincent's lines were obviously written to be funny. But it's interesting, as I've gone through and seen the film in various screenings, like there are screenings where no one laughs at anything, and you walk out of it and everyone's like, Jesus, that was tense. Like, I spent the whole time like kind of freaking out. And then there's ones where people come out and laughing and like, oh my God, what a blast. And so it's interesting to me to like, people not just individual people, but audiences for some reason, like will go in one direction or another. And like, so, getting caught by your mom masturbating is funny on some level. It's also like horrifying. And like, depending on how much you've had to drink, what time of day it is, who you're with at the movies, like that's either going to be funny or it's going to be freaky. So there's certain things that kind of spin either way. But I think when you're dealing with the grotesque, the two responses are to be scared or to laugh. So we'll take either.
And last question. With the beard and the red shirt in the middle there.
I know Darren Aronofsky put his own spin on it, but because the film looks great visually, how much of that did you actually put in the script? And I know you touched on it a little bit, but I was just wondering how much of it was really, you and what you put in the script as opposed to Darren's take.
Well, I mean, it's hard to delineate. Obviously in a script you should only be so specific about the look of things, really. I think when I write anyway, like to me tone is really important and like sort of the feel of a scene and in some way that conveys some sort of visual approach to it, but not so literal as to be like close up on her face as she, or, long, because I think that kind of stuff tends to not be great to it's certainly overused in a screenplay. So I don't know, it's a tough question to answer. I think you'd have to kind of read the script. I think Darren, obviously, when he decided to go handheld, go Super 16, that was a very specialized treatment that I think is largely, if you're going to define the look of the film, comes off of that decision, which isn't in the script at all. But in terms of a mood and feel and how those things would sort of drive the visuals in some way, like I think that is there. So it's tricky.
Can we do one more? Do we have a little window of time? Right here.
Hi, thanks. First, I just love the film, and I'm really glad you're here today.
Thank you.
I have a question about the roles of writing and directing in your own life. I'm sort of a three-part question. One, I'm interested if you're intending to go back to directing yourself at any point. And then the second part is, what would be the creative risks for you in doing that at this point in your career? And then any advice you have to those of us who are also coming from a writing, directing background, and for example, on a first feature, if you have a vision, but there's, sort of a choice about directing it yourself or partnering with somebody else in the interest of a longer term, building a career towards directing, what would you think on that?
Hard question.
It's a good last question.
It is. I do still think about it. For me, it's like, it's a little hard because, I've gotten to see behind the curtain in a very, very intense way, and seeing that even for Darren, less so now because of this film, but leading up to this film, like the struggle it was to even get this film made for him. And The Wrestler was also impossible, and it's like, he's someone who's on a fairly short list of working directors, and yet even for him, these things are an incredible struggle. So I do think, in a weird way, becoming a director, it's this catch-22 where you have to have this sort of blind faith. You can't know too much about what you might be in for. You have to believe it'll happen to you tomorrow, and then it takes 5 years. But every day you think it's going to be tomorrow. And it's hard. My experience has sort of made it harder to trick myself into believing that. But I do think, if I write the right thing, or if there's something that I'm very, very excited about that feels like the right scale, and for me, it's like, I'm not going to just try to direct something. It's going to be more if the right idea comes, and it's like, this feels like something I could really get into and be willing to live with for years and years and years and bleed for. In terms of, I had never actually sort of planned on being a screenwriter so the advantage to being a screenwriter is that you get to work on multiple things all the time. So you're kind of like, if it's a roulette table, you get to put your chips on like a bunch of different numbers. And for me personally, I enjoy, like, if one thing goes away, the emotional damage of that is so much easier because I know, well, I have these other things still cooking, and that's sort of nice about screenwriting. Whereas directing, you really are like committing to one thing for a while, and you have to be willing to really, really live with it. And I think that can be really hard and really emotionally taxing. And so I'm still like, figuring that out for myself to a certain degree, but I think that there are kind of pros and cons of both. Of course, everyone wants to be the director because it's the most exciting position. Once it's happening, you're in charge of this ship. But I also think it gets romanticized, and it's actually incredibly stressful and difficult, especially once you're making things at the millions and millions of dollar level, and the amount of pressure and strain that comes with that. And part of me is like, it's not so bad being home alone, just me and a cup of coffee and a computer. And there's these like moments of like minor stress, but not like a crew and like all this money riding on my shoulders in quite the same way.
Please join me in thanking Mark Heyman.
Thanks, guys.